Hi, I'm Jessica Booth with the Georgia Department of Education. And you're tuned in for We Have the Data, which is assessment for studio arts people. And this has been a really successful in-person PD that we've done all across the state of Georgia. And it was created when I was the fine arts curriculum coordinator with Fulton County Schools many, many years ago. And it was done throughout a district that had over 100,000 students, and it had more than 200 visual art teachers. And in a district that large with more than 100 schools, it's really hard to judge quality and to keep the quality kind of consistent across the school district. And this was a way that we had devised to try to keep the consistency the same throughout the entire district. And what we realized in that time was that we did have the data. It just looked really different than what everyone else's data looked like. We didn't have a standardized test, there was no Scantron, and we didn't have data walls that showed what our students were learning. But we had our students' artwork, and it was a really powerful tool for us to know what we were teaching and where we had places that we needed to work on. I do want to thank Fulton County Schools Visual Arts Department for letting me use their pre-planning time where we did this training virtually as the model for us to use for this training so that we could bring this to the state in a virtual platform. You'll see their teachers working through this on a Teams platform. You will see some students also going through this process as a diagnostic assessment before starting a 3D ceramics assignment. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get a lot out of it. I know that it improved my practice when I was a teacher. It definitely helped me when I was a fine arts administrator, and it's been a great tool for teachers across our state. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Data walls became really prevalent. No Child Left Behind was kind of the educational law of the land, and No Child Left Behind only gave money really to tested subjects. So what we kept hearing about in our schools was like, we want to see your data, we need data. And you would go into the schools and see these horrendous looking data walls. Like every school I would go visit, especially at the elementary level, these were everywhere. And the idea was our data didn't look like that. And it still doesn't look like that. Kind of looked at what was coming down the pipe and with data walls and this huge emphasis on data. And we kind of said, like, well, what is good about data? What is good about a math teacher that gets a standardized test every year? And really the only thing that's great about it is that if you're a teacher and you teach second grade, you get your standardized test scores back. You know exactly which standard the kids didn't do well on. Or you can know exactly for the next year that like you need to drill down farther into what you're doing so that the kids understand this concept. We don't really get that in visual arts, and we don't have that much time to reflect. Reflection's really where you kind of the deep learning happens as teachers and as students. The process of creating exemplars allowed us to reflect on what we were doing as a school district and as a vertical team. And for those folks that are not familiar with vertical teams, it's a fairly simple concept. It's not unlike what you're doing with your fast folks and your zones. The team is typically going to be all the feeder elementary schools that go into all of the middle schools that go into the high school. So this is going to be a single student's K-12 art experience. The idea with exemplars is that they are our data. Like our data is not a bunch of Post-it notes on a wall. It's not a bar graph of our test scores. Our data is our kids' work. And it's really that simple. And if you look at your students' work in mass, you can really start drilling down to see like, okay, on the photo on the left, that's obviously a really high exemplar. It's one of the best ones. It's very difficult to do glass. It's difficult to do different colors. But the idea was that as a teacher, you could look at an entire class's artwork spread out on your tables, and you could individually reflect on it and go, if I just did a better job teaching ellipses, all of these kids' artwork would be up and be better. The idea of exemplars was an identification process that we came up with in Fulton. And like I said, I just recently did it in Columbus, Georgia, and Muskogee County, but I've done it in New York. I've done it all over, is to try to maintain consistent expectations, whether that's in your own classroom or in our case, when we first started it, the idea was trying to get all of the whole school district. So how did we do this? We would meet after school a certain number of times a year. It usually was 3 or 4, but 3 of those meetings we did exemplars or benchmarks. We only worked with middle and high school teachers. We're using the actual artwork in mass to drill down and get the same information for ourselves that we would have gotten with a standardized test because we don't need one. When we did it in Fulton, every middle school and high school teacher participated. It was done by the cluster, so it was feeder patterns. Every teacher submitted artwork, and we did it around certain topics. It was not done by class. Instead of it being done by Visual Arts Comp 1 or Ceramics 1, it was done by things like slab construction, things that we all did across the board, 6th grade through 12, for example, for ceramics. Everybody would contribute. At this time, it was like super ahead of its time technologically. Like, we put things in a Dropbox before there was the app Dropbox. And then it was my job behind the scenes to print hundreds of pictures and make sure that each of the clusters had the exact same photos. And we would literally come together and spread them out on the huge tables in classrooms, and we would sort them. So you would take, like, say it was a still life of just some geometric forms, something that you would do in a basic visual arts comp class or in a middle school class to teach kids the basic forms to be able to draw. We would sort them out and have emerging, proficient, and advanced. Then, as a group, everyone would work together to say all of these emerging drawings have these things in common. All of these proficient drawings have these things in common. All these advanced things have these things in common. So by actually giving it descriptors, it helped us be able to defend, like, why did this student get an A? Why did this student get a B? I started doing it for administrators in Fulton County when I became coordinator. And I had all of the assistant principals in the district at a county meeting, and I had them do it. And, I heard a lot of, I don't know anything about art. I don't know anything about this. I don't get it. Ironically, they sorted the pictures in almost the exact same way that the art teachers did. But it gave them an aha moment that what we do is valid. And the artwork itself is a summative assessment. The sketchbooks can be a diagnostic. They can also be a formative. And I think it opens people's eyes to see that what we're doing is just as relevant, if not more relevant, than what's happening in a standardized test situation. It's real learning. And it's allowing us as teachers to reflect on what we taught and reflect on what the students learned. Usually you would have a fight over a couple of them that, were on the border between emerging and proficient in the groups. But in general, it got faster and faster the more we did it, but it gave people a lot of aha moments. It was totally anonymous. Nobody knew whose artwork was whose. And it was not uncommon for middle school artwork to be in the advanced category with, like, AP students' artwork. So it really showed in some ways that our middle school teachers are at as high a level of excellence with their students as our high school teachers. And I think that was really empowering for them as a former middle school teacher. But it also showed weaknesses. There were times when you were like, wow, my kid's work that I thought was really great that I sent in for coil construction when I taught ceramics was in emerging. And, I need to figure out what I did wrong. But now I have this list of descriptors that shows me the things I need to change.
I've been asked to talk about the benchmark process and talk a little bit about the benefits of that. I'm totally sold on the benchmark process. We went through a lot of growing pains when we first started out, not really knowing what we were doing, but we realized that different teachers across the district didn't have the same expectations of what was quality work, proficient work, or work that needed improvement, and we wanted to get everybody on the same page. So we initiated a process of bringing in student work samples and discussing those. And some of the things that came out of that process that weren't necessarily expected, but the interaction, which is very valuable. New teachers were able to interact with experienced teachers and discuss things that they thought were strengths and not strengths, and the newer teachers that had more cutting edge things from the preparation programs were able to throw in their input, and people started coming together to some middle ground or understanding about what is the proficient expectations, who exceeds the expectations, and who still needs to move up to the expectations. So that whole dynamic of talking with each other and seeing wherever was just an educational process in and of itself. Then we could go and put in work, and then all of a sudden people had to tell why they thought something was proficient in its outcome and why it wasn't. So teachers learned to be articulate about that, which they could in turn share with their students. The other thing that's come out is we have those 3 categories: emerging, proficient, and advanced, and we can have samples, and we can even literally have those printed out, discuss an assignment, lay out some samples that relate to that assignment, and ask the students why this one doesn't meet the requirements or expectations of that. So it's good with the students as well. I think overall it just puts us all on the same level of what we are expecting from our students, that we're all on the same page and we understand how it works.
Ron said really eloquently is some of the things that I've seen since is because of the virtual PLCs. There's several art teachers in there, Sahira and Heather, that were involved in this process as young teachers. And they're both still sort of using the benchmarking process that we now call exemplars in their classrooms. Like Heather had students critiquing other students' artworks from another year and using those exemplars for them to see, like, well, what makes this one need more work? What makes this one need more time or craftsmanship? And the kids were really reflecting on the work that they were looking at. Is we're looking for emerging work, which is going to show areas of weakness, and it's going to kind of show that the student doesn't grasp all the concepts. Proficient work is that they get it, and then advanced work is that they understand all the necessary concepts, but they're also exceeding the expected outcomes. And this can be done in your own classroom or as a cluster or zone. Here's an example of our ceramic slab exemplar session. What ended up happening is we went through things that were really common. We did value to model form, portraits, color. So the idea was we were doing these big topics, and then we started kind of saying, okay, let's do something for 3D. So we did ceramic slab because we figured it was done at the middle school level all the way through high school. And what really happened from all of this work is we saw that our sculpture and ceramics programs needed a lot of work, that our drawing portfolios and our 2D portfolios for advanced placement art at the high school level were really, really strong. And in comparison, our 3D portfolios were much weaker. But it really helped me as coordinator know what staff development I needed to create for that next school year. We really spent a lot of time on staff development for surface decoration, for all different kinds of construction methods in ceramics and sculpture. And what we really saw was that the difference between the advanced slab pieces on the bottom and the ones on the top, in a lot of cases, is just surface technique. It drove our staff development. The teachers in the district at the time selected what we were going to do as an exemplar. Then we looked for weaknesses, and then we brought in on the final end, or I did as coordinator, people and experts in whatever it was that we needed to work on. So now that you kind of get it, like emergings, they didn't get it. Proficiency is they got it, and advanced is like they got it and they're awesome. At that point, we started looking at the artwork. We've already divided into 3 categories, and we started literally with Post-it notes with a list of descriptors and sequential skills. So first we went through and said, okay, I got my little Post-it notepad. I'm looking at the emerging, and I'm saying all these slabs are really flat, and put that down. Then the next person put theirs down. So it ended up becoming these big lists of descriptors for what does emerging look like as opposed to advanced for that particular concept. Or then we looked at sequential skills, and that kind of took the pressure off some of our teachers. So it said, you know, these skills really should be taught at the middle school level. And then these are really going to be visual arts comprehensive 1. And then these are really going to be the advanced classes. So that you kind of knew as a teacher, like, this was advanced for where you're supposed to be with this class. So this example was one of the very first ones we did. It was value to model form, and it was a still life. So you look at the top of the emerging are forms that we've used for years for kids to learn, you know, some fabric on the wall pinned up, a few old broken instruments, you know, the typical still life stuff. But we really looked at it and kind of broke down those skills to see, okay, how is this going to work? These are some examples of the descriptive criteria for that one, which was value to model form. Some of the emerging traits that we saw were limited range of values, often no really dark darks, and a lack of subtle variations in shade. Proficient was stronger, it was more subtle gradations, value was evident, and then advanced had like high key, low key, naturalistic, high contrast. These would be the proficient traits for this one. And these are the proficient traits that our teachers came up with when we did this at the time. So lines were used purposely. They were not outlines. You could really understand where their light source was coming from. You had more complex forms in terms of wrinkles and folds, careful observation, better composition, stronger and more subtle gradations of value. The idea was that we could actually say why these were in the middle category and not the emerging or the advanced. From there came these sequential skills. So these are the idea that these skills are aligned with particular courses that middle school for value and model form. We felt like in middle school, they should have an intro to what observational drawing is. They should leave there at least knowing this is what observational drawing is. They should have an introduction to contour lines. They should have some value scales and understand steps and blending. They should be able to draw simple shapes. They should have value and understand, the idea of a cast shadow. Rudimentary understanding of perspective. If you're teaching visual arts comp 1, this is kind of what you are striving for. So yes, you have your standards, but this is kind of on top of it and more specific and drilling down and giving you the information that you would have gotten had you had somebody else evaluate it from an outside source. And I did this a lot with my own artwork as a teacher. When I taught ceramics, I would have all the kids put their artwork on the countertop for me to grade it. And while it was all there, I would start moving things around so that I could see in each project kind of where I needed to tweak it for the next time around. So for observational drawing, you kind of see they're telling you they need to understand parallel perspective and 2-point perspective. They need to understand ellipses. Ellipses was a big deal when we did value and model form, but it just keeps growing. And then when you get to drawing 1, it really goes into mark making and talking about the perception of space and starting to have artistic voice. And that really was the difference for value and model form in the upper levels of drawing and AP, is that they're doing everything in emerging and proficient, but they're more sophisticated. They have a greater sense of artistic voice, and they understand everything from the previous classes. So John Riggins actually coined this, and it was perfect as we were in a cluster meeting, and he said, this is all the same when you boil it down, is that you're emerging, proficient, and advanced. Really the difference, if you think about a child from kindergarten to 12th grade, and it's brilliant, is it's first you learn technical skills, then you learn composition, then you learn concept and conceptual skills. And we always call conceptual skills, and AP and College Board at the high school levels really drilled this in as artistic voice, but it's conceptual skills. We're moving from technical skills only into composition skills into conceptual skills. And even in the third dimension, composition skills are still really important.
When we have our benchmark meetings and work as a team to sort out the imagery that we've all collectively contributed to the batch, we sort all the images into the categories of emerging, proficient, and advanced. And there's always those images of work that are borderline. And as a group, we have open dialogue about what really makes those images belong in one category or the other. And what it does is it helps you to understand not just the big picture, but really dive in there and ask yourself, what are the details of the qualities of the curriculum that are working and not working, and in a really specific way. For example, in art introduction, when we teach a color abstraction lesson, I'm able to print out the benchmark images and show the students the emerging, proficient, and advanced. And then when I speak with my co-teacher, we can look at the results that students get and learn how to teach the lessons better so that what was originally our emerging work moves up to the proficient category, and what was originally proficient can move up to the advanced category. So we do self-evaluations.
This process was really good in that it created a lot of dialogue between middle and high school that we had never had in the past. And we really knew each other. Like, we spent a lot of time together. It gave our whole department a sense of community that we hadn't had before. The process really tightened up what we were doing. The end result or the end goal was not like all of our kids got 5s, everybody won awards, but that's kind of what happened. It made us so much better as teachers. And I had, as a teacher and then as a coordinator, so many aha moments where even in my own teaching, I was like, God, it's such simple things that I could change to make this whole process or this whole project better. I taught ceramics, but I have an illustration degree. So I took a ceramics class at Spruill on my own money and learned how to throw with one hand. I was not a great ceramics teacher. When I went through the benchmarks process, the exemplars process, I looked at my work and said, I as a teacher need to learn more about surface decoration, because construction wise, I ended up getting my master's in sculpture, but construction wise, my kids' work was really good. But when they put the glaze on it, it was a disaster zone, like hot mess from then on. They're doing dip glazes that somebody already made that they didn't even make the color for. So when I started learning about terra sigillata and smoke fire and raku and all of those things, my kids' work was so much better that I don't think it was as apparent that I was not really a ceramics teacher by the end of it. And a lot of us had those situations where you grew as a teacher because you were actually spending, even if it was just a couple hours through the year, reflecting on your own artwork and your own teaching and your students' artwork in your classroom. Technique is a vocabulary and expression is our story. So if we keep using that analogy, like I always would tell the kids, the elements of art are like the nouns and pronouns of the art world. And then we organize our art into compositions through the principles, and that's the technique. We use those elements and principles, we create great compositions with the kids, and then we get their own artistic voice in it. We're really making quality artwork. We're having a really quality program, and the kids are achieving things that they would not have achieved without us reflecting on the process. These were some of the benefits that we saw while I was a FAFSA person and while I was coordinator. Student achievement did increase district-wide. In some schools, it was remarkable, the change. System level expectations, like the fact that we were all discussing this, helped equalize programs. There were some aha moments where I was like, I really need to up my game. I don't understand ceramics decoration at all, and it's a hot mess, and I'm going to have to do something about what I'm doing to be able to make this better. It gave me the tools to be able to verbalize exactly why the student received the grade they did. And I know as an administrator, it gave me, with the assistant principals and the principals, when I did exemplars with them, it definitely gave them a different perspective on what we do. And we were definitely seen as more relevant and more academic because they were able to sort these in the same way. And they were even able to come up with the descriptions. They didn't understand the sequential part of it because they don't understand what classes go into which classes, but their descriptions were pretty good. It created a professional learning community for the first time within the feeder patterns, and staff development for 6 years was driven at the county level by weaknesses we found through analyzing our work. So you as the teacher were really responsible for what I, coordinator, had to come up with as training. And then reflection's just good. And it really is why we learn. It's why we have the kids critique their own artwork. Why wouldn't we critique our own students' artwork to reflect on our own teaching?
We start with technique, and I always talk about my ceramics 1 class as being more of a technique course, and then when we move on into ceramics 2 and then certainly in ceramics 3, it becomes more about concept. And so that makes sense when you think about technique and then composition and then concept that Jess was talking about.
It was a moment of self-reflection, like, am I pushing my kids how they need to be pushed? Okay, so if I'm looking at all the examples and my kids are struggling like with vertical lines or, the vanishing point or whatever it is, allow that to be a moment, okay, where this is where I need to focus on to make my kids, work better. And that moment of self-reflection will really help to drive, you in the classroom and your teaching. That's what it did for me anyway.
I have so many PowerPoints that end with emerging proficient and advanced work. And just being able to look at, I don't want to have to turn that in for every single unit at the moment, but it was helpful. There was something to what I think, and then taking that and comparing it to see how the county thought about that as well. It was very helpful.
Andrea or Amanda, can either of you speak to, I think we did, when we were calling them benchmarks, with middle school and high school together, and was there a moment when you felt like looking at these exemplars gave you a better idea of how middle school is driving the skill building for higher level courses?
Yes, I would say for like what I noticed the most, and I was a baby teacher when we started doing these, was that it really gave me an idea of what I should be doing as a teacher to support the high school levels because of what the end goal was. And this practice really gave me an idea of what the end goal was and like where I can get my kids started in terms of like what's the most important thing for me to give my kids as a basic so that they can go and grow when they get beyond me because they're starting in middle school. They're just starting and they're just beginning to understand so that hopefully they can take from where I am or from what I'm giving them and be able to build upon that later.
So as an example of value to model form, we would normally have, what would you say, like 40 examples?
These are good examples. And quite honestly, I think, again, if you look at these through the lens of, or being just based on the skill level, it kind of changes. I mean, if someone produced the first example, so the example on the left is what we would be calling emerging. If someone is producing that in an intro to art or visual art comp 1 class, they're doing pretty well. You know, they're getting the basic shape. They're drawing in a way that is that shows perspective. They are, you know, the line seems intentional. They're not using a dark outline to define the shape. So we're not saying that because we're calling it emerging here that it would get a C or a B. You know, it could still be an example of advanced work within that course. However, when you look at it through the lens of, is it a great example of technique, composition, and then concept, then maybe it's falling a little bit short. And do you guys agree? Oh, I love the thumbs up. Thank you. So hopefully you guys can identify some skills or some qualities, maybe I would say, in these images that from one to the next lifted up from emerging to proficient and then proficient to advanced. And Jenny, you're right, stronger composition, more variety. So a larger, yes, Marnie, a larger range or wider range of values, activating the edges. Yes, more intentional marking, maybe marks that are going with the contour of the form as opposed to just randomly horizontal or vertical or diagonal. Source, thank you, Sean. Okay, so cropping the image or activating those borders.
Which this can start conversations like, so on a still life, how does a student show student voice?
And each group would divide those up from emerging to proficient to advanced. And then we would bring those 3 groups together and put the emergings together, the proficients together, and the advanced. And then we would spread them all out and see if there were any discrepancies or one, you know, if you know, everyone was in general agreement. And then I think during the small groups, someone would be recording why we thought this pile was emerging and this one was proficient and this one was advanced. And then we would put that information together. So again, you know, group 1 may have said activate edges and group 2 may have said, you know, utilize the borders. So we're both saying the same thing. So we would write that down and so especially when groups were in agreement on what makes something advanced or proficient or emerging, we would know that those would be signifiers. Proficient?
Yes.
And then the bottom left was advanced, whereas I prefer the composition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I prefer the composition on the one on the right.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, I mean, I don't know.
And that's where right now, like, y'all try this out and, you know, this is where this could end up, you know, this is an artificial example because all of the 40 plus people in this room aren't having a real time, aren't really doing this in real time. So yeah, throw out some, like for me, like the one that we have is emerging. One of the reasons is the paper's wrinkled, so that's craftsmanship. Would be one example.
The shading in the bottom left one, I think it is advanced, but I do enjoy the composition of the one on the right more.
What are some signs, signifiers, I'm going to use that again, of good observational drawing? So some of you people that are better at this: proportion, larger value range, scale.
Yes.
Huh?
Because the one on the bottom left, I don't feel like they used the size of their paper well.
But also in doing this, there needs to be an understanding of observational drawing. Like if this was in the value to model form category or in the composition category, it would be totally different, right? The proficient, emerging, proficient, advanced. So if we're looking at just the observational drawing technique of the student,
And I like
Go ahead.
I like what Natalie's saying about showing scale by having objects in the background. So the overlapping, creating that sense of depth and atmosphere is a good compositional element that you don't see in the one on the right. You guys see, and this happened a lot, where you would think, oh no, the one on the right is definitely best. And now I'm seeing all these things and I'm like, oh no, it is the bottom left. The bottom left is the better one.
Yeah.
I'm like, I was dead wrong, you guys. Thanks.
But that conversation helps.
Yes. Yes.
That's
and again, I think everyone's voice is important, but it's so wonderful to be in a room with a bunch of teachers who teach value to model form or observational drawing, for most of their day. And so you get to start to understand, oh, well, this is what their end game is. So I know now when I'm teaching observational drawing in intro that I should be working towards that. Way to provide a diagnostic assessment is through critique and analysis of examples. And by showing students work and having them answer questions about the work without telling them anything, you can glean from them if they understand what the process was, what the construction technique is, what the project criteria are. You can have them, get an idea of what their ideas on craftsmanship are. So this is an example that I created for online learning. Typically, I would have my students do this in a face-to-face scenario, and I would group them, and they would get samples, and they would have to arrange those samples from the most to least successful. And I try to provide a range. So, I've got one that's very successful, one that's kind of middle of the road, and one that maybe is less successful. And they have to decide as a group, what that range is. And then they have to answer questions based on those examples. Like, what do you think the project is? So for example, with something like this, the students had to make 3 pinch pots. Okay, well, what else? Well, the 3 pinch pots maybe had to be correctly constructed. Well, what does that look like? Even thickness walls. Maybe they had to have a foot. They had to have a unifying design. So all of this information students are collaborating on and sharing. And then from this information, you can directly relate it then later to the summative assessment, your rubric that you are creating. So this particular assessment would fit into the responding point 3 standard, which is engaging in a process of art criticism to make meaning and increase visual literacy. So, I also have them use your art words. They have to discuss how the elements are demonstrated, and then they have to reference those elements, or they have to reference elements in discussing how principles are demonstrated. So as I mentioned, I typically would have this done as a group activity.
Range examples from most to least successful. Which qualities define each set as more successful or least successful?
Okay, so I think these are probably the most successful ones.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Probably these are the middle ones, and these are probably the least.
And then the qualities that define each set as successful or least.
Well, I think most successful one we chosen is because it has a pretty constant thickness at the rim. It doesn't seem to have too much unintentional surface.
I think the middle ones are joined kind of awkwardly, but they kind of have the same thickness, so that's good.
It's definitely better than the last one, which has a lot of cracking towards the top and uneven thickness.
Yeah.
And then the tripods also have a lot of unintentional surface details that crack right there.
Yeah. Okay.
You also got the middle one. This one doesn't seem to fit the same theme as these other two are, because we also have this side that's completely smooth.
Mm-hmm.
This side that's like scratched up. It doesn't really fit this like more pattern themed.
Looks like they were just quickly put together.
Yeah.
Okay. Based on the examples, what are the criteria of the assignment? This includes construction, design, and craftsmanship.
I think it was to make a slab tripod and include texture.
And for all of them to like fit together.
Yeah.
Yeah, they made like a trio in design and surface area, surface design.
So we already chose which one was the most successful. So how has the artist achieved success with the construction of the form? And what does successful execution of this technique look like?
Well, yeah, like we said, it doesn't have a lot of cracking in the most successful ones. And they seem to be together in a trio rather than the other ones that are cracking, and they don't look like they fit together.
And slab also has a more consistent thickness throughout all three forms. And the opening is a lot more smooth. As opposed to these three. That one, yeah, this one has a little thinner on that side.
How has the artist created visual interest through the demonstration of the elements of art? Line, color, shape, form, space, texture, value. List and describe 3.
Well, they definitely use texture on all of them actually. So.
I think form is a really good one too, just to see how it was like put together and how it all matches.
And these kind of include line with the different patterns that it has.
I think the best one shows contrast between the textured parts and the nice smooth parts that are meant to be like a background.
It really shows the design instead of the second one. I think it's just a bunch of random designs, especially with that random one. Okay, how has the artist created visual interest through arranging the elements to demonstrate the principles of design, which is movement, rhythm, emphasis, proportion, balance, unity, variety, and pattern?
Well, I think the best one shows unity because all of them look like they belong in a trio together.
I think balance could also be one, how they're all like working together.
They're not like wobbly or anything.
It also showed movement because how the textures kind of got that like hash kind of look that goes down the form. This one also kind of shows movement with it like going around the form as well.
Okay, what was the artist trying to achieve what's the story, what was the artist inspired by, and what are they trying to communicate?
Well, I think maybe this one was inspired by like, I don't know, nature or leaves, maybe because it looks like leaves or of some type.
Kind of looks like, yeah, like seaweed or something at the bottom.
Okay, and how has the artist achieved high quality craftsmanship? What does good craftsmanship look like?
Well, I think it looks like making sure that nothing's like wrong with the form, intentionally wrong with the form.
Yeah, it's smooth and they're all like the same shape. They're similar characteristics.
They all fit together in a good trio. There's minimal cracking, and there's consistent thickness between the slabs.
The openings are pretty much even and circular.
I hope that that was useful and something that you, if you don't already do that, can take back to your classroom. I think having examples for students to look at and be able to pick up and touch and compare is more helpful than written instruction anytime.
I hope you enjoyed this session of We Have the Data, assessment for studio arts people. I think sometimes we forget that the student artwork really is our data, and it's just as relevant as anything that's on a standardized test. Through this session, you saw what our data really looks like, teachers, it live online, analyzing student data in a large school district. You also saw students actually using the same process of looking at emerging, proficient, and advanced artwork in a diagnostic format with their teacher analyzing it, looking at the beginning of a project and how they would look at artwork as a way to be successful before they started a project. I hope you enjoyed this session, and at the end you will see a QR code. If you enjoyed it and you would like to see more, please take that QR code and fill out the brief 5-question survey. Again, I'm Jessica Booth. I'm joined by Paul McLean and Casey Hall as the team at the Georgia Department of Education, and we are here to serve you.